May 8th, 1945. Victory Day. Across America, church bells rang out in jubilation. Ticker tape rained down on Times Square like confetti from heaven. Sailors kissed nurses in crowds drunk on relief and joy. Mothers wept at kitchen tables clutching telegrams that said their boys were finally coming home. The war in Europe had ended. Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally. After 6 years of blood and darkness, the lights were coming back on. But 1,847 miles southwest of that celebration, inside the barbed wire fences of Fort Sam Houston, Texas, 347 German women heard two words that felt like a death sentence. "You're free to go." Catherine Mueller pressed her face against the sun-heated chain-link fence, feeling the metal burn her cheek in the brutal Texas heat. She watched American soldiers raise the stars and stripes over what had been her barracks just 72 hours earlier. The flag climbed slowly, deliberately, each foot of ascent, marking another inch of the Third Reich's descent into history. The swastika that had flown over this compound when she arrived was gone, now burned in a barrel behind the command post, reduced to ash and memory. The Reich she had served as a telecommunications officer had collapsed like a house built on sand. Everything she had known, everything she had believed, everything she had been, had crumbled in the space of 3 weeks. And now she stood among hundreds of female prisoners of war at this hastily constructed detention facility outside San Antonio, waiting to learn their fate, waiting to discover whether liberation meant survival or simply a different form of death. Major Robert Callahan stood on the wooden platform in the center of the compound yard, his uniform already dark with sweat despite the early hour. At 35 years old, he looked older. 26 months of European combat from Normandy, through the Ardennes and across the Rhine, had carved lines into his face that made him appear a decade beyond his years. He had overseen the liberation of concentration camps weeks earlier. Those scenes haunted his sleep, the skeletal figures, the mass graves, the oven still warm. Those images would live behind his eyes until the day he died. These women were different, complicit perhaps in the machinery of Nazi Germany, but hardly the architects of genocide. Most had been conscripted into auxiliary services, the Wehrmacht's Helferinnen doing clerical work, and communications that freed men for combat roles. They had typed reports, routed messages, filed paperwork, managed supplies, the unglamorous machinery of military administration that every army required to function. "Gather them in the main yard," Callahan had instructed his deputy, Captain William Thorne, that morning. "I'll address them all at once. Get this done quickly and move on to the next problem." The women assembled in nervous clusters as the Texas sun climbed higher, turning the compound into an oven. Some were barely 20 years old, fresh-faced girls who looked like they should be in college dormitories, not prisoner of war camps. Others were well into their 40s, weathered by war and loss, their eyes carrying the weight of too many funerals. They had been soldiers' wives, farmers' daughters, school teachers, and shop girls before the war machine swallowed their lives whole and spit them out here, 8,000 miles from home, standing in the dust of a foreign land that had defeated everything they once knew. Catherine stood near the front, her military bearings still intact despite 3 months of captivity. At 32, she occupied the middle ground between the frightened girls and the exhausted older women. She had lost her brother Franz at Kursk in 1943, killed in the largest tank battle in history. His body never recovered from the burning wreckage of a Panzer IV. She had lost her fiancé Wilhelm at Stalingrad, that same year captured by the Red Army, and never heard from again. His last letter had arrived 6 months after the battle ended, written in the frozen hell of encirclement, telling her he loved her, and that he was sorry for leaving her alone. She kept that letter in her pocket, still the paper worn soft from handling the ink faded, but the words burned into her memory. Her parents had died in Dresden. February 1945. The firestorm that consumed the city had taken them both in a single night of flame and suffocating heat. She had learned of their deaths from a Red Cross notification that arrived with all the warmth of a bureaucratic form letter. Her entire family, everyone she had ever loved, gone. Erased, turned to ash and memory in the span of 2 years. Beside Catherine stood Anna Brenner, 29 years old, sharp-featured and sharp-tongued, a former communications specialist from Breslau. Her city now sat behind Soviet lines occupied by the Red Army, its German population expelled, or worse. Anna's mother and sister had been there when the Soviets arrived in January. She had not heard from them since. The silence told her everything she needed to know but refused to accept. To Catherine's left stood Elizabeth Hoffman, 44 years old, her gray hair escaping from its bun in the oppressive heat. She had been a widow since Stalingrad, where her husband died in the same encirclement that took Wilhelm. Her two sons had disappeared somewhere on the Eastern Front during the long retreat from Russia. Missing in action, presumed dead. The words meant the same thing but allowed her the fiction of hope. Before the war, she had managed her husband's grocery shop in Königsberg. Now, Königsberg was Soviet territory renamed Kaliningrad, and her shop existed only in memory. And there was Maria Klein, 23 years old, the youngest of their small group, orphaned by the Hamburg firestorms of 1943. She had worked in postal services, sorting mail for soldiers who were dying faster than the letters could reach them. She was small and scared and looked like she might blow away in a strong wind. She had tried to make herself invisible for 3 months, succeeding until this moment when invisibility was no longer an option. Sergeant Ernst Kaufmann stood beside Major Callahan on the platform ready to translate. Kaufmann was a Jewish refugee from Munich who had escaped to America in 1938, getting out just ahead of Kristallnacht, leaving behind cousins and aunts and uncles who had not been so fortunate. He had joined the army the day after Pearl Harbor, driven by rage and the need to strike back at the regime that had destroyed his family. He had expected to hate every German he met in uniform. Instead, he found himself looking at women who reminded him of his aunts, his cousins, his neighbors from before the nightmare began. It complicated his anger in ways he had not anticipated. Hate was easier when the enemy had no face, no story, no humanity. These women had all three. Ladies, Callahan began, his voice carrying across the silent yard. Kaufman translated into crisp German, his Munich accent strange in this Texas heat. The war in Europe has concluded. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. We have verified your identities and service records. None of you are wanted for war crimes or crimes against humanity. The women exchanged glances. Hope flickered in exhausted eyes like candles in the wind, fragile and desperate. Callahan continued, "Therefore, effective immediately, you are free to go." He paused, expecting the words to land like liberation. Instead, they landed like stones. The gates will open in 1 hour. You may return to your homes, to your families, to whatever remains of your lives. We will provide you with basic rations for 3 days and documentation confirming your release. We wish you luck in the difficult times ahead. Kaufman's voice echoed across the yard, each translated word falling into a silence so complete that Catherine could hear the flag snapping in the hot wind. Callahan expected relief, perhaps tears of joy, maybe even celebration. He had seen newsreels of liberated prisoners dancing and singing when freedom came. He had witnessed the explosion of gratitude when concentration camp gates opened and the skeletal survivors realized they would live. Instead, he watched the color drain from dozens of faces. Women who moments before had stood with military bearing suddenly seemed to collapse, inward, shoulders sagging, under an invisible weight that crushed hope before it could fully form. Catherine felt ice spread through her chest despite the 100-degree heat. Free to go. The words should have been beautiful. Instead, they were a death sentence dressed up in the language of liberation. "Sir," a voice rang out clear and strong. It belonged to Anna Brenner. She stepped forward from the ranks, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands that she could not quite control. "Sir, I request permission to speak." Callahan nodded, surprised. The formality was unnecessary. They were prisoners being released, not soldiers standing inspection. But old habits died hard, especially for those who had lived under military discipline for years. "Speak," he said simply. Kaufman translated. Anna took a breath that seemed to draw strength from some reservoir of courage Catherine had not known she possessed. Major Anna said carefully, measuring each word like a woman diffusing a bomb. Many of us, we have nowhere to go." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the compound as Major Callahan stared at Anna, trying to process what he had just heard. In 26 months of European combat, he thought he had witnessed every variation of human desperation. Soldiers begging for morphine as they bled out. Civilians pleading for food as their children starved. Refugees clutching photographs of missing family members, asking if anyone had seen them, knowing the answer would be no. But this was different. This was prisoners refusing freedom. This violated every assumption about human nature that war had taught him. "I don't understand," Callahan said slowly, watching Kaufman translate. You're prisoners. We're offering you freedom." Anna took another breath. Behind her, dozens of women nodded in silent encouragement, urging her forward, depending on her to articulate what they all felt but could not voice. "Major Callahan, let me explain what freedom means for us. My home was in Breslau." She paused, the name itself painful in her mouth. "Breslau is now behind Soviet lines. The city has been reduced to rubble. My mother and sister were there when the Red Army arrived. I have not heard from them since January." According to accounts documented by the International Committee of the Red Cross in their 1946 report on prisoner treatment, Anna's situation was tragically common among German military personnel originating from Eastern territories. She was one of millions cut off from home by Soviet occupation, stranded in a geography that no longer recognized their claim to belonging. Anna continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm. "Elizabeth over there, her village near Königsberg, no longer exists as Germany. It is now Soviet territory. Catherine's family home in Dresden was destroyed in the February bombings. Even those from Western cities faced destruction. Most of our families are displaced, scattered to refugee camps, or dead. We have no addresses to return to, no homes waiting for us." Callahan felt Captain Thorne's shift beside him. This was not what either officer had anticipated. They had prepared for gratitude, for relief, for the messy logistics of processing releases and arranging transportation. They had not prepared for refusal. But surely Callahan began searching for the logic that would make this make sense. "There is more, Major." Anna's voice hardened, taking on an edge that cut through the heat. "We are women who served in the Wehrmacht. Do you know what happens to such women when they fall into Soviet hands?" The Major knew. Everyone knew, though few spoke openly about it. The reports from the Eastern Front were explicit enough when you read between the bureaucratic lines. The Red Army's advance through Germany had been accompanied by systematic violence against civilians, particularly women. Female soldiers and auxiliaries faced special brutality, seen as collaborators in the Nazi invasion that had devastated the Soviet Union, as traitors to their gender, as legitimate targets for revenge. "The Americans are here," Anna said, gesturing around the compound with one hand. "You have discipline, laws, order. Out there," she pointed beyond the fence toward the shimmering heat of the Texas landscape that might as well have been the surface of the moon, for how alien it was to her out there. "Germany is chaos. There are millions of displaced persons wandering through ruins. There are criminals, desperate men. And worst of all, there are German men who now blame women like us for supporting the regime they themselves served. They look for scapegoats, and we are convenient targets." Elizabeth Hoffman stepped forward, her weathered face set with determination. "Major, I am 44 years old. Before the war, I managed my husband's grocery shop. I have no husband, no shop, no sons, no home. If you release me, where do I go?" Her voice cracked but held. "I become another starving refugee on roads already clogged with millions. I will be robbed before nightfall, violated by dawn. And if I am very lucky, I will die quickly rather than slowly." Callahan looked to Kaufman, whose face had gone pale as he translated. The sergeant's jaw clenched, his own family history, giving him intimate knowledge of what happened when civilization collapsed and desperate people turned on the vulnerable. He had heard the stories from the relatives who made it out. He knew what chaos looked like when law and order evaporated and human nature revealed its darkest capacities. Catherine Muller stepped forward, then her military bearings still evident despite the faded work dress that had replaced her Wehrmacht uniform. "Major Callahan, we are not asking for comfortable imprisonment. We are asking for survival." Her voice carried authority, the tone of someone accustomed to being heard, to being obeyed. "In this camp, we have food. Not much, but more than waits outside these fences. We have shelter from the elements. We have protection from those who would harm us. We have American soldiers who follow the Geneva Convention, who treat prisoners as human beings rather than objects of revenge." She took 2 steps closer to the platform, close enough that Callahan could see the intelligence in her eyes, the calculation of a woman who had thought through every angle and arrived at a conclusion that must have cost her something to reach. "Please understand, Major, we are not Nazis. Most of us never were. We served because we were ordered to, because our brothers and fathers were fighting and dying, because our nation demanded it, and refusal meant prison or death. We were foolish, perhaps, complicit in the machinery of evil, certainly. But we were also Germans trying to survive a war we did not start and could not stop. Captain Thorne leaned toward Callahan, his voice low. Sir, this is highly irregular. We have orders. Release the prisoners. He searched for words adequate to the strangeness unprecedented. That's an understatement, Captain Callahan muttered. He removed his cap and ran a hand through his thinning hair, already soaked with sweat. He thought of his wife Barbara back in Oklahoma, of his daughter Sarah, who would be starting at the University of Texas in the fall, bright and idealistic, and convinced the world could be made better through effort and good intentions. He tried to imagine them in these women's circumstances. Homeless, terrified, facing a landscape of predators and ruins, begging for the mercy of continued imprisonment because the alternative was worse than captivity. The thought made him physically ill. How many of you feel this way? Callahan called out across the yard. How many would prefer to remain here as prisoners rather than accept immediate release? Hands began to rise, slowly at first tentatively, as if the women feared punishment for this unprecedented request, then faster with more confidence as they saw others making the same choice. First a dozen hands, then 50, then 100, then more. Catherine counted quickly, her years of managing communications giving her an instinct for numbers and logistics. 287 hands in the air. Of the 347 women in the compound, more than 80% were begging to remain imprisoned. The absurdity of it would have been comical if it were not so profoundly, heartbreakingly tragic. Enemy combatants refusing liberation. Prisoners choosing captivity. The paradox violated every principle that war was supposed to establish. Winners were supposed to be magnanimous in victory. Losers were supposed to be grateful for mercy. Freedom was supposed to be universally desired. But standing in that Texas heat, watching nearly 300 women raise their hands to beg for continued imprisonment, Callahan understood something the newsreels and the propaganda posters had never captured. Freedom without safety was not freedom at all. It was just exposure to new forms of violence. And these women survivors of a catastrophe that had consumed everything they knew understood that truth in their bones. He would have to report this to Third Army headquarters. General Patton himself would probably want to weigh in. This was unprecedented in his experience, though he suspected similar scenes might be playing out across occupied Germany as the reality of liberation collided with the chaos of defeat. Very well, Callahan said finally, his voice carrying across the yard. I will contact headquarters for guidance. Until I receive further orders, you will remain here under current conditions. Dismissed. The women did not cheer. They simply lowered their hands and returned to their barracks in quiet relief, walking back toward the buildings that represented imprisonment and safety in equal measure. Catherine found herself standing with Anna, Elizabeth, and Maria in the shade of the barracks, overhang the four of them drawn together by some unspoken recognition of shared fate. Do you think he will let us stay? Maria asked, her voice small and frightened. I don't know, Catherine said honestly. But we made our case. Now we wait. Anna lit a cigarette with shaking hands, the American tobacco a luxury she had acquired through trading. If they force us to leave, I am going north, away from Soviet zones, maybe find work in the British sector. There is no work, Elizabeth said quietly. There is only chaos and survival. The British have their own problems. They are not running charity operations for former Wehrmacht personnel. Then what do we do? Maria asked, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Catherine put a hand on the younger woman's shoulder. We survived today. Tomorrow we will survive tomorrow. That is all anyone can do right now. Survive one day at a time and hope that eventually the days add up to something that resembles a life. In his cramped office, Major Callahan sat with the telephone receiver pressed against his ear, waiting for the connection to Third Army headquarters to go through. The heat in the small room was oppressive, the single fan doing nothing but push hot air in lazy circles. Outside his window, he could see the women returning to their routines with the strange normalcy that characterized life in the compound. They had been here 3 months now, transferred from European capture points via Atlantic transport processed through the massive prisoner of war system that had swallowed millions of German soldiers and now struggled to figure out what to do with them all. The women had adapted to captivity with the resilience that women seemed to possess in greater measure than men. They had organized themselves into work details, maintained military discipline, out of habit created small communities within the barracks. They wrote letters to Red Cross offices trying to locate missing family members. They taught each other English phrases. They sewed and mended and made the best of circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. And now they were refusing the freedom he was required to give them. The absurdity of it struck him again. He was a prison warden whose prisoners refused to leave, a liberator whose liberated refused liberation. The situation had no precedent in regulations, no guidance in the manuals, no clear path forward. "Henderson, this is Colonel Morrison." A gravelly voice crackled through the telephone line, fading in and out with static. "I have your preliminary report in front of me, and I'll be damned if I know what to make of it. You're telling me German prisoners are refusing release." "Not refusing, sir," Callahan corrected, "requesting to delay it. They have made rational arguments about their safety concerns." He summarized the afternoon's events, watching through the window as Anna Brenner organized an evening work detail. Even in captivity, military structure persisted. It gave shape to days that would otherwise collapse into shapeless waiting. Morrison was silent for a long moment, the static on the line the only indication the connection had not been severed. "The general is not going to like this," he said finally. "We have millions of displaced persons to deal with, refugee camps overflowing across Europe, and now German military personnel want to stay in our custody. It sets a hell of a precedent, Major." "Sir, I have been thinking about that all afternoon," Callahan said, pulling out a cigarette before remembering he had quit last month and putting it back with a grimace. "What if we reframe this? These women have skills: communications, clerical work, medical training. Germany needs administrators to help rebuild. What if we use them as civilian workers while gradually transitioning them back into society?" The line crackled with static. "Go on, we keep them in a supervised environment, but put them to work in American military administration. Pay them minimal wages. Help them locate surviving family members. Give them time to find safe places to resettle. It is not imprisonment, sir. It is a transitional program." Callahan could hear papers shuffling on the other end. "That might work," Morrison said slowly, thinking it through. "But you would need to clear it through military government channels. We would also need to ensure we are not violating the terms of the Surrender or Geneva Convention provisions." According to documentation from the United States Army Center of Military History, similar improvised solutions had emerged across occupied Germany in May 1945 as commanders grappled with the unprecedented refugee crisis. The rulebook had not anticipated this situation, so officers were writing new pages in real time, making it up as they went, hoping someone higher up the chain would provide clarity that never quite arrived. "I will draft a formal proposal," Sir Callahan said. "But in the meantime, what do I do with 300 women who do not want to leave?" "Keep them there," Morrison ordered. "Feed them on existing prisoner rations. But Henderson, make it clear this is temporary. We cannot run prisoner camps for volunteers. The optics alone would be a nightmare if it gets back to the press." The call ended, leaving Callahan staring at the pile of service records covering his desk. Each folder represented a life disrupted, a future uncertain, a human being trying to navigate the aftermath of catastrophe. He picked one up at random. Maria Klein, age 23, from Hamburg. Communications specialist in postal services. Both parents killed in 1943 firestorm bombing raids. Brother missing on the Eastern Front. No living relatives located. Where exactly was Miss Klein supposed to go? What was she supposed to do? Walk out the gate with 3 days' rations and best wishes, then disappear into the chaos of a broken world? The injustice of it gnawed at him, made his chest tight with frustration at a system that had clear rules for combat, but no guidance for compassion. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Catherine Muller entered, escorted by an MP, but clearly not under duress. She had requested this meeting through proper channels, demonstrating the same respect for protocol that had characterized her service in the Wehrmacht. "Major Callahan," she said in heavily accented but functional English. "The women wish to propose an arrangement." Callahan gestured to a chair. She remained standing, maintaining military protocol, prisoner addressing captor, with the formality that created distance and structure. "I am listening," he said. "We understand that keeping us here creates logistical burdens. We consume food, require guards, occupy space needed for other purposes. We propose to work in exchange for continued protection and basic provisions." Her English was better than she had let on. She must have been practicing with the American personnel learning rapidly the way intelligent people do when survival depends on communication. Many of us have administrative skills, Catherine continued. Anna Brenner is an expert in telecommunication systems. Elizabeth Hoffman has years of supply management experience. I myself supervise communications for an entire division. We can help process paperwork for displaced persons, assist in communications, work in supply management, whatever your headquarters requires. We ask only for shelter food and time to locate safe situations before being released into whatever Germany has become. Callahan considered this, his mind already calculating the possibilities. Third Army headquarters was indeed drowning in administrative work. The occupation government processed thousands of documents daily: displaced person registrations, denazification questionnaires, supply requisitions, communications between headquarters and forward units scattered across the continent. Skilled workers would be invaluable, and these women were offering exactly that. I will include this in my proposal to headquarters, he said carefully. But I need absolute clarity. You understand that this would be voluntary work, that you are technically free to leave at any time. We understand, Major. We are asking for the paradox of voluntary imprisonment. It sounds insane, I know, but the alternative is worse. After Catherine left, Sergeant Kaufman remained in the doorway. Sir, may I speak freely? Always, Sergeant. Kaufman lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. My family fled Munich in 1938. We left behind neighbors, friends, people we had known for generations. When I joined the army, I was angry. I wanted to destroy Germany for what it had done to us, to Europe, to the Jews. He paused, smoke curling toward the ceiling, hanging in the still air, like a question without an answer. But these women, sir, they are not the SS. They are not the Gestapo. They are not the architects of the camps. They are just people who got caught in a machine bigger than themselves, and now that machine has chewed them up and spit them out, and we are the only thing standing between them and oblivion. What are you saying, Sergeant? I am saying I came here expecting to hate them, and I find that I cannot. I can hate what Germany became. I can hate what was done in Germany's name. But these individual women, they are just trying to survive. And that is something I understand. Callahan nodded slowly. War would be simpler if enemies stayed enemies, if moral clarity remained clear, if the lines between good and evil did not blur in the messy reality of individual human beings trying to navigate impossible circumstances. But nothing about this war had been simple, and the aftermath was proving even more complicated than the fighting. That evening, as the sun finally released its grip on the Texas sky and temperatures dropped to merely oppressive instead of unbearable, Catherine sat with Anna, Elizabeth, and Maria in the barracks common area. Other women gathered in small groups, talking quietly, writing letters, mending clothes, engaging in the small rituals that made captivity bearable. Do you think it will work? Maria asked. The proposal Catherine honestly did not know. It depends on whether the Americans value pragmatism over regulations, whether they see us as resources or liabilities. Anna exhaled smoke through her nose. They will see us as whatever serves their purposes. That is how occupying powers work. We are useful, so they will use us. When we stop being useful, they will discard us. You are very cynical, Elizabeth observed. I am very realistic, Anna corrected. I have no illusions about American benevolence. They are not doing this out of kindness. They are doing it because we solve a problem for them. Does it matter, Catherine asked quietly, as long as we survive? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and essential. Did the motivation behind mercy matter? Was salvation less valuable if it came from pragmatism rather than compassion? These were philosophical questions for a world at peace. In the aftermath of catastrophe, survival was its own justification. The women sat in silence as darkness fell, each lost in her own thoughts, her own fears, her own fragile hopes, that tomorrow might be slightly less terrible than today. In that silence, in that gathering darkness, in that space between war and whatever came next, they waited for answers, for clarity, for someone to tell them whether they would live or die, whether they would stay or go, whether the world had any place left for German women who had served the losing side and now sought mercy from the victors. They waited, and in the waiting they survived one more day. May 15th, 1945. 1 week had passed since Catherine Muller and 287 women had made their impossible request. 1 week of waiting, of uncertainty, of existing in the liminal space between prisoner and freed person, between enemy and something undefined that had no name in any regulation or manual. The response from 3rd Army headquarters arrived by courier, delivered in a jeep that kicked up dust as it roared through the main gate. The driver handed Colonel Morrison's packet to Major Callahan with the casual indifference of a man who had no idea the papers he carried held the futures of nearly 300 human beings. Callahan read the authorization 3 times, making sure he understood correctly. Morrison had worked quickly navigating the Byzantine bureaucracy of military government with surprising efficiency. The program had been approved. Voluntary Labor Auxiliary Program, they were calling it. A pilot initiative, an experiment, a solution to a problem no one had anticipated and everyone was now scrambling to address. He assembled the women in the compound yard on a morning that promised another brutal day of Texas heat. They stood in loose formation, not the rigid military ranks they had once maintained, but not quite the disorganized cluster of civilians either. They existed between definitions, between categories, between the world they had known and the world they were trying to enter. Ladies, Callahan began, and Kaufman translated with the fluency born of repetition and necessity. I have received authorization from 3rd Army Command to establish a pilot program. Those of you who wish to remain under American military supervision may do so under the following terms. He unfolded the official document, though he had memorized its contents during a sleepless night, spent wondering if he was making the right choice or the easy one, and whether there was any difference between the two. First, you will no longer be classified as prisoners of war. Your status will be redesignated as civilian auxiliaries under military supervision. Second, you will perform administrative and logistical work for United States military government operations. Third, you will receive basic wages of 50 Reichsmarks per month plus standard rations and accommodation. 50 Reichsmarks was nearly worthless given the currency's collapse, but it was something. More importantly, the rations and accommodation meant survival in a world where survival could not be taken for granted. Fourth, Callahan continued watching their faces for reactions. You may leave this program at any time. You are not prisoners. You are workers who have chosen to remain in a structured environment during Germany's transition period. Fifth, we will assist in locating your families and finding permanent civilian positions as they become available. He paused, letting Kaufman's translation settle over them like a blanket, warm and fragile, and potentially insufficient against the cold reality of their situations. Are there any questions? Elizabeth Hoffman raised her hand with the tentative gesture of a woman unsure if she still had the right to speak. Major Callahan, will we be allowed to write letters to search for our families? Yes, Callahan confirmed. We will provide assistance through the Red Cross and military mail services. Will we be permitted to leave the compound for supervised activities? Maria Klein asked, her voice barely audible, a whisper that Kaufman had to strain to hear. Eventually, yes. Initially, you will remain here while we establish protocols. But the goal is gradual reintegration into civilian life, not permanent detention. Catherine stepped forward, her bearing still military despite the faded work dress and the 3 months of captivity that should have broken any residual pride. Major, on behalf of the women here, we would like to formally accept these terms. We also want to thank you. She paused, searching for English words adequate to what she felt. You did not have to do this. You could have followed regulations and released us to chaos. Instead, you chose the harder path. We will not forget. Callahan felt uncomfortable with gratitude. He had not done this purely out of kindness, though compassion played a role. Pragmatism had been equally important. The Army needed workers. These women needed protection, and improvised solutions were the order of the day across occupied Germany, where the rulebook ended and human judgment began. The work began immediately. The women were divided into details based on their documented skills and experience. Catherine Muller was assigned to head a communications office, processing 3rd Army message traffic routing orders and reports between headquarters and scattered units across Texas and beyond. Anna Brenner supervised a typing pool handling the endless paperwork of occupation, the forms and questionnaires and documentation that military government generated like a machine that could not be turned off. Elizabeth Hoffman managed supply inventories, tracking the flow of materials through warehouses, ensuring that rations and equipment reach the right destinations at the right times. Maria Klein worked with Army Postal Services, helping route mail for the millions of displaced persons scattered across Europe, soldiers trying to find family members, refugees searching for anyone who remembered their names. According to research compiled in the historical volume Aftermath: Life in the Post-War Rubble, published by historian James Penton in 1973, such improvised arrangements were common across occupied Germany, though rarely documented officially due to their irregular nature. Commanders made decisions based on immediate needs rather than long-term policy, creating systems that worked in practice even if they violated the spirit of regulations written for a different kind of war. The work was demanding. American military government in the occupation zones processed thousands of documents daily: displaced person registrations, denazification questionnaires, supply requisitions, communications between headquarters and forward units. The women worked 8-hour shifts 6 days a week, far longer than Geneva Convention prescribed for prisoners, but less than they had worked during the war, when 12 and 14-hour days were routine and complaints were treason. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison arrived from 3rd Army Headquarters in early June to oversee the program's implementation. She was 28, a Wellesley graduate who had spent the past 2 years managing Women's Army Corps administrative services in England. Now she found herself responsible for former enemy personnel in circumstances no training manual had addressed and no classroom had prepared her to handle. Major Callahan. I have reviewed the files, Morrison said during their first meeting, sitting in his office with a stack of personnel folders thick enough to serve as furniture. These women's situations are heartbreaking, but I am concerned about precedent. Have you considered the broader implications if word spreads that German prisoners can choose to remain in American custody? Callahan had considered little else. Lieutenant, we are not publicizing this. It is a localized solution to a specific problem. By autumn, most of these women should be placed in civilian positions or reunited with families. And if they are not, Sir Morrison's question cut to the heart of the issue. Germany is going to take years to stabilize. Some of these women may never find their families. What happens then? Do they become permanent American dependents? It was a fair question without a good answer. Callahan changed subjects, seeking safer ground. How are they integrating with your WAC personnel? Morrison's expression softened slightly, the bureaucratic concern giving way to something more human. Better than expected, actually. I was concerned about hostility. These women were literally the enemy a month ago. But the WACs seemed to view them more as survivors than adversaries. She flipped through her notes. Sergeant Dorothy Williams has been teaching English phrases to some of the younger German women. Williams was African-American from Atlanta, a career soldier who had navigated her own forms of discrimination and displacement. She recognized survival when she saw it, recognized the look of people trying to build something from nothing. Corporal Patricia Jenkins shares her cigarette rations. Morrison continued. Jenkins was from Wisconsin, blonde and optimistic, and convinced that people were fundamentally good if given the chance to prove it. The German women call her their American sister. Tobacco is international diplomacy, Callahan observed. The State Department should take notes. Over the following weeks, routine solidified and the compound began to feel less like a prison camp and more like a temporary workers' barracks. The women formed friendships that crossed the divide, separating former enemies. They shared photographs of absent families' faces frozen in happier times, moments before the world caught fire. They taught each other songs in German and English, the melodies creating bridges that language alone could not build. They traded stories about the places they had come from, cities and towns that existed now only in memory and ruin. But the outside world kept intruding in painful ways that reminded them the war had ended, but the aftermath had just begun. In mid-June, Elizabeth Hoffman received notification through Red Cross channels. Her village near Königsberg was confirmed as part of Soviet-annexed territory. Her home no longer existed as a physical structure or legal address. The building had been destroyed during the Soviet offensive. The land now belonged to the Soviet Union. She was officially stateless, a woman from nowhere, a ghost with a heartbeat. She took the news quietly in the barracks, sitting on her bunk and folding the Red Cross letter with hands that shook despite her efforts at control. That evening, Catherine found her staring at a photograph of her 2 sons in Wehrmacht uniforms, both dead somewhere in Russia. Their bodies never recovered, their graves unmarked and unknown. I am 44 years old, Elizabeth whispered. Too old to start over. Too young to simply die. What am I supposed to do, Catherine? What purpose is there in surviving when everything I live for is gone? Catherine sat beside her saying nothing because there was nothing to say. What comfort could words provide against the void of total loss? Germany had broken itself, and the pieces included millions of women like Elizabeth, survivors of a catastrophe that had consumed everything they knew and everyone they loved. You survive, Catherine said finally, because the alternative is surrender, and we did not beg to stay here just to give up now. But for what? Elizabeth asked. What future waits for a stateless widow with no family and no home? I do not know yet, Catherine admitted, but we will find out together. July brought complications that threatened the fragile stability they had built. The heat intensified, turning the compound into an oven, where even night brought little relief. Temperatures reached 108 degrees, and the barracks lacked any cooling beyond the inadequate fans that pushed hot air in lazy circles. Captain Ross, the medical officer, treated 14 cases of heat exhaustion in a single day, women collapsing from the combination of physical labor and environmental stress. But the heat was the least of their problems. On July 12th, a group of discharged Wehrmacht soldiers gathered outside the compound's main gate, drawn by rumors that German women were living comfortably under American protection while German men starved in the ruins of their defeated nation. There were about 40 of them, ragged and bitter, some missing limbs, all missing hope. They had survived the war only to return to a Germany that no longer existed, to find their status eliminated and their futures erased. They pressed against the outer fence, shouting abuse at the women visible inside the compound. Their words were vicious, laden with rage born from watching their world crumble and finding someone weaker to blame. They called the women traitors and collaborators. They accused them of spreading their legs for the victors while German men bled for the fatherland. The language was crude and cruel and designed to wound. Sergeant Kaufman brought the report to Callahan early in the morning, his face tight with concern. Sir, there are about 40 of them out there. Most look like they just walked out of Russian captivity. Barely alive but angry as hell, they are shouting at the women, calling them names I will not repeat. Callahan grabbed his uniform jacket and sidearm. Captain Thorne and a squad of military police followed as he strode toward the main gate, his boots kicking up dust in the morning heat. The scene was uglier than Kaufman had described. The former soldiers had pressed close to the outer fence, their faces twisted with rage and pain, and the desperate need to make someone pay for what had been taken from them. At the front stood a man missing his left arm, his face scarred from burns that had healed badly, his eyes hollow with loss. I am Major Robert Callahan of the United States Army, Callahan announced in English, letting Kaufman translate. This is a military facility. You will disperse immediately or be arrested. The one-armed man stepped forward, his remaining hand clenched into a fist. This is Germany, American, not your country. These women are Germans, and they live better than we do while we starve. Callahan kept his voice level, projecting authority without aggression. These women are civilian employees performing administrative work. They earn their rations through labor, just as you can if you register with military government employment offices. Employment? The man laughed, a sound bitter and broken. There is no employment. There is only ruins. We fought for 6 years, and this is our reward. Watching German women serve the victors while we beg for scraps. Behind Callahan, Captain Thorne shifted his weight, his hand resting on his holstered sidearm. Thorne was from Alabama, a career officer who had lost his brother at Normandy. His voice carried the slow drawl of the Deep South and the hard edge of personal loss. Sir Thorne said quietly with respect, these women wore enemy uniforms. My brother died at Omaha Beach fighting Wehrmacht. Why are we bending over backward to help them? Callahan turned to face his deputy, aware that this conversation was as much for the assembled soldiers beyond the fence as for Thorne himself. Captain, your brother died fighting for American values. One of those values is that we treat prisoners humanely. The Geneva Convention is not just paper. It is what separates us from the Nazis. These women did not kill your brother. They typed reports and routed messages, and now they are asking for basic human decency, food, shelter, safety. We give them that not because they deserve it, but because we are Americans. That is who we are. Thorne held Callahan's gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. My brother would have said the same thing, sir. He believed in doing right, even when it was hard. Beyond the fence, some of the anger seemed to deflate from the assembled men. Rage needed fuel, and Callahan had offered understanding instead of confrontation, context instead of condemnation. But the one armed man was not finished. He pointed at Catherine Muller, who had moved to the inner fence to watch the confrontation. That one, he said, she supervised communications. She helped coordinate operations against our own soldiers. She is a traitor to Germany. Before Callahan could respond, Catherine spoke, her voice carrying across the distance in clear German. I am Catherine Muller, formerly of the Wehrmacht Communication Service. I know your anger. I understand your pain. We are all victims of a war our leaders started and could not win. The man spat on the ground. Victims, you sit comfortable while we starve. Catherine's voice hardened, taking on steel. I had a brother, Oberleutnant Franz Muller, killed at Kursk in 1943. I had a fiancé, Hauptmann Wilhelm Brenner, captured at Stalingrad. I have heard nothing from him in 3 years. My parents were killed when Dresden burned in February. I have no home to return to, no family to rejoin. I am as lost as any of you. The assembled men shifted uncomfortably, their anger seeking purchase, but finding only fellow sufferers, other victims of the same catastrophe. We are not living in comfort, Catherine continued. We are surviving day by day, trying to endure long enough to rebuild something from ruins. If you want to hate someone, hate the men who led us into this nightmare. Hate the Nazis who promised victory and delivered annihilation. But do not hate us for trying to stay alive. The one-armed man stared at her for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. My wife was in Hamburg when the firestorm came, July 1943. She burned alive with our 2 children. I was in France, could not get leave. When I finally came home, there was nothing, just ash and rubble and bones. His voice cracked, the rage dissolving into grief. I do not hate you, Frau Muller. I hate that this is what Germany has become, that we are reduced to fighting over scraps while the world we knew turns to dust. He turned and walked away. Slowly, grudgingly, the others followed, melting back into the shimmering heat, leaving only dust and silence, and the memory of rage that had nowhere to go. Callahan released a breath he had not realized he had been holding. That was either very brave or very foolish, Miss Mueller. Catherine met his eyes through the fence. In Germany now, Major, those are the same thing. But that evening, Anna found Catherine in the barracks, her expression troubled. You made peace with them today, but those men will talk. Their words will spread. Other men will come. Angrier men, men who will not be swayed by sympathy or shared loss. Then we will face them when they come, Catherine said. 2 weeks later they came. Franz Schmidt, a discharged Wehrmacht Oberst, filed a formal complaint with U.S. military government headquarters. He alleged that Fort Sam Houston provided preferential treatment to German women while German men starved. He claimed the program violated Geneva Convention by giving prisoners benefits beyond basic provisions. He demanded investigation and closure of what he termed comfort arrangements between occupiers and occupied. The accusation was inflammatory and largely false, but it gained traction among displaced German men who needed scapegoats and found them in women who had made different choices, who had chosen survival over pride, who had accepted help from former enemies. German-language newspapers in San Antonio and New Braunfels cities with large German-American populations ran stories with headlines designed to provoke outrage. Die bevorzugten Frauen, the privileged women, Amerikanische Gunst für deutsche Frauen, American favor for German women. 3 demonstrations occurred at other auxiliary facilities that had adopted similar programs based on Callahan's model. Rocks were thrown, windows broken. At Fort Bliss in El Paso, a mob attempted to storm a compound gate. American guards fired warning shots. In the confusion, 2 German civilians were hit. Both survived, but the incident became a scandal that reached newspapers as far as Washington. Lieutenant Morrison arrived at Callahan's office with an armful of press clippings, her face grim. Major, this is spiraling out of control. The German press is turning this into a scandal. Displaced men are seeing it as evidence of American favoritism toward women. Public sentiment is shifting against us. Callahan read the articles, recognizing distortion and manipulation even through the German text he could barely parse. This is propaganda. Half these claims are fabricated. Morrison's expression did not change. It does not matter, sir. Perception becomes reality in politics. Third Army is getting pressure from military government, from State Department, from the German civilian administrators we are trying to establish. They want this problem to disappear. What are you saying, Lieutenant? I am saying you have maybe 6 weeks before someone higher up decides this program is more trouble than it is worth and shuts it down. You need to start transitioning women out faster into permanent civilian situations before the decision is made for you. Callahan pulled out the placement statistics. He had been tracking the numbers that told a story more complicated than any headline. 287 women enrolled in the program, 43 placed in civilian jobs over the past 6 weeks, most through Red Cross connections, German-American organizations, and allied military government clerical positions. 244 remaining. Average placement rate of 10 to 12 women per month. At the current rate, full transition would take 20 months. But pressure was building far faster than placements. The mathematics of it were impossible and everyone knew it. That night, Catherine had called an emergency meeting with Anna, Elizabeth, and Maria in a supply room where they could talk without being overheard. Anna had been listening to American radio broadcasts, German language programs transmitted from New York that reached across the continent. They are talking about us, Anna said, lighting a cigarette with hands that trembled, calling us collaborators, opportunists, women who traded dignity for safety. Maria was crying, her young face streaked with tears. We did not trade anything. We just wanted to survive. Elizabeth put an arm around the younger woman. Survival is always purchased at some cost, child. The question is whether the cost was worth paying. Catherine leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. We have to accelerate placements, find civilian positions faster, even if they are not ideal situations. Anna exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. Doing what Catherine, Germany's economy is shattered. Here in America, we are former enemies with no legal status. Who is going to hire us? The question hung in the air, unanswerable and essential. In his quarters that night, Major Callahan wrote a letter to his daughter, Sarah, at the University of Texas. He told her about the women, about their impossible choice, about the complexity of mercy in the aftermath of absolute war. He told her that he hoped she would never face such circumstances, but that if she did, he hoped someone would show her the same compassion he was trying to offer. Sarah wrote back 3 days later. Her letter was long and thoughtful, full of questions about justice and responsibility and how to reconcile individual humanity with collective guilt. Dad, she wrote, there is a German exchange student here named Greta. She got stuck when the war started. Her family is in Hamburg. She has not heard from them since the firestorms. Everyone treats her like she personally ran Auschwitz. I tried to be friendly. Other girls called me a Nazi sympathizer. How do we know who deserves mercy and who deserves punishment? How do we separate individuals from the nation they served? Callahan read the letter twice, wishing he had answers simple enough to fit in a response. But there were no simple answers. Only choices made in the moment, judgments called from incomplete information, mercy extended or withheld based on instinct and hope, and the fragile belief that human beings were more than the worst things their nations had done. He wrote back that night, telling Sarah there were no easy answers, only the daily work of trying to do right in circumstances where right and wrong blurred into shades of gray that no manual could navigate. The women waited, the pressure built. And in the compound at Fort Sam Houston, 244 German women who had begged to remain imprisoned now faced the possibility that their sanctuary might be taken from them before they were ready to survive without it. June 20th, 1945, 2:30 in the morning. The compound slept in the oppressive heat that even darkness could not relieve. Corporal James Martinez walked his perimeter check with the methodical precision of a soldier who had learned in combat that complacency killed. He had survived the Battle of the Bulge by paying attention to details other men missed, by noticing when something was wrong, before wrong became fatal. Tonight, something was wrong. The section of outer fence near the laundry facility showed signs of tampering. Fresh scratches on the metal. Wire cutters had been used, the work abandoned halfway through. Martinez crouched low, examining the ground with his flashlight. Cigarette butts, German brand, Juno. He recognized them from interrogating prisoners in Europe, and there, half hidden in the grass, a small notebook. He opened it carefully. Inside, a list of names written in precise German script. 12 names, all women from the program. Catherine Muller, Anna Brenner, Elizabeth Hoffman, Maria Klein, 8 others. Beside each name a notation. Catherine's read Rundfunkhelferin Verräter, Radio Auxiliary Trader. Anna's read Fernsprechbetreiberin, Collaboratorin, Telephone Operator Collaborator. Martinez ran for the command post, the notebook clutched in his hand, like evidence of a crime not yet committed, but clearly planned. Within 20 minutes, Captain David Foster from the Criminal Investigation Division was on site summoned from Fort Hood, where he had been investigating black market operations. Foster had the tired eyes of a man who had seen too much human cruelty to be surprised by any new variation of it. The investigation moved quickly. CID had been tracking several former SS officers known to be in the Texas area released from POW detention, but under surveillance. One, Sturmbannführer Ernst Richter, had disappeared from monitoring 3 days earlier. Richter was former Gestapo, a true believer, who refused to accept defeat, who saw cooperation with Americans as treason, deserving the ultimate punishment. Foster interviewed the women whose names appeared in the notebook. Catherine sat across from him in Callahan's office, her face pale but composed, her hands steady, despite the fear that must have been coursing through her veins. "Miss Muller, do you know Ernst Richter?" Catherine thought carefully. "The name is familiar. He was Gestapo liaison to Wehrmacht communications. He would have had access to personnel files. He knew who we were, what we did, where we served. Why would he target you specifically?" Catherine's laugh was bitter. "Because I am still alive. Because I chose survival over ideology. Because I work with Americans instead of dying in the ruins of the Reich. For men like Richter, that makes me a traitor." Callahan ordered immediate security enhancement, additional armed guards on 24-hour rotation, women confined to the inner compound, no outside work details until the threat was neutralized. Perimeter patrols doubled. All visitors screened through CID. The compound became a fortress, the women prisoners again in all but name. The fear was palpable. This was exactly what they had dreaded when they begged to stay in May. That even in American custody, Nazi fanatics could reach them. That the ideology that had consumed Germany would hunt them across the ocean, would punish them for the sin of surviving. That evening, Catherine gathered all 244 women in the mess hall. The room was hot and crowded, the air thick with tension, and the smell of bodies pressed too close together. She stood on a chair so everyone could see her, so her voice would carry to the back. "I know you are frightened," she began. "I am frightened too. We escaped the war only to discover the war has not escaped us. There are men who believe we are traitors because we survived, because we worked with Americans, because we chose life over ideology." Women nodded, some crying, others simply staring with the hollow eyes of people who had endured too much and were being asked to endure more. "But here is what they do not understand." Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger. "We are not traitors to Germany. We are survivors of Germany's catastrophe. We did not betray our nation. Our nation betrayed us. When it started a war it could not win, when it committed atrocities in our name, when it consumed its children for the sake of a madman's vision. So yes, we work with Americans. We type their reports and route their messages and manage their supplies. Not because we love our conquerors, but because we love ourselves enough to stay alive. And I will not apologize for that. Not to Ernst Richter, not to Franz Schmidt, not to anyone." The applause started slowly, then built to something approaching defiance. Even Anna, usually cynical and skeptical, had tears streaming down her face. Elizabeth stood and embraced Catherine when she stepped down from the chair. Maria clung to both of them, a child seeking shelter from a storm that would not end. July 4th, 1945, Independence Day. Callahan had authorized a special celebration for the women supervised and contained within the compound, but a gesture toward normalcy, toward the possibility that life could include moments of joy, even in the aftermath of catastrophe. Corporal Billy Ray Watson volunteered to man the grill, bringing his Tennessee expertise to the task of preparing real American barbecue. Watson was 24, a combat veteran who had landed at Omaha Beach and fought across France and Germany. He had returned with a purple heart and nightmares that woke him screaming, but also with his mother's conviction that everyone deserved kindness and nobody deserved to starve. The smell hit the compound like a physical force. Hickory smoke, slow-cooked meat, spices the women could not identify but recognized as abundance made tangible. Watson piled plates with beef brisket ribs glistening with sauce that caught the sunlight, corn on the cob dripping with butter that had not been rationed or diluted or replaced with margarine. Catherine took the plate he handed her and stared at it for a long moment. The meat was so tender it fell apart at the touch of her fork. She bit into the brisket. Smoky, sweet, savory, layers of flavor that wartime Germany's rations could never approach. Fat and juice ran down her chin. She did not care. For the first time in 4 years, food tasted like something other than fuel for survival. Beside her, Elizabeth was crying while eating ribs, tears mixing with barbecue sauce, in a combination that should have been absurd, but was instead profoundly human. "I forgot food could taste like this," Elizabeth whispered. "I forgot abundance existed." Watson handed Catherine a bottle of Coca-Cola, cola condensation running down the glass in the July heat. She had never tasted it before. The first sip was revelation, sweet and effervescent and utterly American, a beverage that seemed to capture optimism in liquid form. Watson raised his own bottle toward the assembled women and American soldiers who had gathered for the celebration. "Ladies, today is July 4th, American Independence Day. We celebrate freedom. Y'all are not free yet, but you are working toward it. That is the American way. Anyone can earn a second chance through hard work." Catherine stood raising her Coca-Cola bottle, the gesture awkward but sincere. "To America, the nation that shows mercy to enemies and feeds the hungry. May we become worthy of your generosity." American soldiers and German women toasted together in the fading light, the barriers between them dissolving in the simple act of sharing a meal, of celebrating survival, of acknowledging that perhaps the future did not have to be defined entirely by the past. But the celebration was brief. July 18th brought the crisis to its climax. The MP patrol spotted a figure near the fence line at 3:15 in the morning, a different section from the previous attempt. The figure fled when challenged, disappearing into the civilian neighborhood adjacent to Fort Sam Houston. The pursuit involved military police, CID agents, and local San Antonio police who had been briefed on the threat. They found Ernst Richter in a church basement 2 blocks from the compound, hiding among old hymnals and forgotten Sunday school materials. He was 38 years old, still wearing his SS wedding ring, despite regulations requiring its removal, still carrying the ideology that had defined his adult life and now had nowhere to go except into violence. Captain Foster conducted the interrogation personally, with Sergeant Kaufman translating and Major Callahan observing through a one-way mirror. Richter was unrepentant, his eyes hard, with the certainty of a true believer who would rather die than acknowledge his cause was lost. "These women are traitors to the Reich." Richter said, his voice flat and cold. "They cooperate with occupiers, live in comfort while true Germans suffer. They deserve punishment according to military law." "The Reich no longer exists," Foster said quietly. "Military law no longer applies. What you planned was murder." Richter smiled, the expression chilling in its complete lack of warmth. "I planned justice." Catherine Mueller supervised communications that aided enemy operations against German forces. Anna Brenner worked with Americans within days of capture. Elizabeth Hoffman trains new German civilian administrators to serve the occupation government. "They are collaborators." Foster leaned forward. "How did you get their names?" "Personnel files are classified." Richter's smile widened. "You think all SS officers are in custody? Some of us walk free. Some work in your own administration. We have access to everything we need." The implications hit Callahan like a physical blow. Someone inside U.S. military government had leaked classified personnel files to a former SS network. This was not an isolated fanatic. It was organized remnants of the regime still operating, still hunting, still pursuing ideological purity even in defeat. Third Army ordered comprehensive security review of all auxiliary programs across the American occupation zone. Every German civilian employee was screened. Background checks were conducted with new rigor. The investigation revealed 7 former SS officers working in low-level positions across military government offices, hired under false identities, with forged papers that had passed initial scrutiny. The scandal erupted across military and civilian channels. Congressional inquiries were launched. Press coverage intensified. Senator McCarthy gave a floor speech condemning the coddling of German prisoners, while American boys had died to defeat them. Photographs of Fort Sam Houston women appeared in newspapers with captions designed to inflame rather than inform. The program became a liability. The political pressure became unsustainable. The decision came down from levels so high that arguing against it was futile. Colonel Morrison delivered the news, personally flying to San Antonio to tell Callahan face-to-face rather than through the impersonal medium of official correspondence. They sat in Callahan's office while the compound went through its evening routines outside the window, women returning from work shifts, unaware that their sanctuary had just been given an expiration date. Major Callahan, effective August 31st. The Voluntary Labor Auxiliary Program will be discontinued. All participants must transition to civilian status or accept repatriation to Germany by that date. No exceptions. Callahan felt the words land like blows. Sir, that is 6 weeks. We have 244 women. We cannot possibly place them all safely in 6 weeks. Morrison's face was sympathetic but inflexible. I understand. But the decision came from Eisenhower's staff. The political pressure is overwhelming. The security concerns are legitimate. The program is finished, Robert. I am sorry, July 20th. Evening. The heat had relented slightly, temperatures dropping to merely oppressive instead of unbearable. Callahan assembled all the women in the mess hall. He did not sugarcoat the news. They deserved honesty, even when honesty was brutal. Ladies, I have difficult news. The program that has sheltered you these past months will end August 31st. You have 6 weeks to find civilian employment or accept repatriation to Germany. The room erupted. Women shouting questions, their voices overlapping in panic. Where do we go? How do we find jobs? You are sending us back to ruins. We will be killed. The fear was palpable, and a living thing that filled the room and choked the air from everyone's lungs. Catherine stood, her voice cutting through the chaos. Silence. Let the major speak. The room quieted, 244 women, looking to her for leadership, for answers, for some indication that survival was still possible. Major Callahan, Catherine said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, on behalf of these women. I asked why. Callahan explained. The security concerns, the political pressure, the scandal, the SS infiltration, the impossibility of maintaining a program that had become more controversial than the problem it solved. I fought to keep this program running, Callahan said quietly. I lost that fight, I'm sorry. Catherine met his eyes across the crowded room. Major, you gave us 3 months of safety, 3 months to heal, to plan to survive. That was 3 months more than anyone else offered. Do not apologize for doing what you could within a system that did not care whether we lived or died. She turned to face the assembled women. We have 6 weeks. We will use them. Every woman here will leave with a job, placement, or safe destination. We will not waste the time Major Callahan bought us. The mobilization began immediately. Catherine organized the women into action teams with the efficiency of someone who had managed military communications for an entire division. Anna led the job search committee, contacting every Red Cross office in Texas, reaching out to German-American organizations, identifying civilian employers who needed clerical workers and might be willing to hire former enemy nationals. Elizabeth headed the housing search, finding boarding houses willing to accept German women, negotiating group housing arrangements, identifying church sponsorship programs, and immigrant assistance organizations. Maria, despite her youth and fear, took charge of skills, documentation, typing professional resumes for each woman, translating German credentials into American formats, creating portfolios that demonstrated their capabilities. The American personnel volunteered to help in ways that went beyond duty. Sergeant Dorothy Williams personally contacted African-American churches, drawing on her own community's experience with discrimination and displacement to find allies who understood survival. Corporal Patricia Jenkins wrote recommendation letters in her neat school teacher handwriting, vouching for women she had worked beside, putting her own reputation behind former enemies, because she believed BOA people deserve second chances. Sergeant Kaufman worked overtime translating documents connecting women with Jewish refugee assistance organizations, despite the complicated history, despite the pain of helping people whose nation had tried to exterminate his family. Lieutenant Morrison used her Wellesley alumni network, calling in favors from graduates who had married into Texas society, who controlled hiring at universities and hospitals and government offices. Even Corporal Watson helped, teaching the women to cook American style, to use American appliances to navigate American social customs that would make the difference between employment and rejection. The placements came in slowly, one by one, small victories in a race against time. Anna Brenner was hired by U.S. military government as a civilian translator, the first woman from the program to achieve such a position. Her salary was $45 a month, substantial by 1945 standards, and housing was provided in a San Antonio boarding house. She wept when she received the offer, not from joy, but from relief so profound it felt like grief. Elizabeth Hoffman was placed with a farming family near Fredericksburg, Texas, in the heart of German-American country, where the language and culture felt almost like home. The family had lost their adult son in the Pacific Theater, and they needed a farm manager, someone with Elizabeth's skills and experience. They offered room and board, plus a small wage. More importantly, they offered belonging. Maria Klein secured a clerical position with the Red Cross in Dallas. It was entry-level, barely above menial, but it was stable and legal, and came with dormitory housing alongside other female employees. She would be poor, but employed, struggling, but safe, alone, but not abandoned. 37 women were hired collectively by a San Antonio garment factory whose owner was a German immigrant who had arrived in 1920 before the nightmare began. He remembered what it felt like to be foreign and suspect and trying to build a life in a country that did not quite trust you. He paid low wages but provided group housing in a converted warehouse and treated them with the dignity of workers rather than the suspicion of enemy aliens. Various Texas churches sponsored 42 women through denominational programs, Lutheran and Catholic congregations that believed mercy was not optional but mandatory. Some sponsorships worked, creating communities that embraced the women and helped them integrate. Others collapsed within weeks as congregations divided over whether helping Germans was Christian charity or betrayal of American boys who had died fighting them. But there were difficult cases, women who fell through every crack in a system not designed to catch them. Greta Zimmerman was 52, with severe combat trauma that manifested in catatonic episodes and screaming nightmares. She could not function in civilian employment. She required psychiatric care that 1945 medicine was barely equipped to provide. She ended up in a Texas state mental health facility, a warehousing institution that Catherine visited monthly, becoming an unofficial advocate for a woman the system had no room for. 34 women chose repatriation to Germany despite the risks, despite everything. They had various reasons. Some hoped to find surviving family members, a hope so desperate it overrode rational calculation of danger. Some could not adapt to American culture, and language could not navigate a world so alien to everything they had known. Some were simply depressed and hopeless, convinced they would die either way, and preferring to die on German soil. Callahan arranged military transport to Bremerhaven, Germany, the major port of embarkation for the occupation forces. He provided each woman with 30 days of rations, letters of transit, documentation of their service to U.S. military government, and $20 in occupation currency. It was insufficient, but it was something. Catherine and her core group saw them off at the San Antonio train station on a humid August morning. One woman, Ingrid Bauer, 41 years old, from Munich, hugged Catherine with desperate strength. "I know I am probably going to die over there, but I need to try. I need to see if my children survived. If there is any chance, I have to know." "I understand," Catherine said. "I hope you find them." Ingrid smiled, the expression sad and resigned. "And if I do not, at least I will die trying. That is worth something." The train pulled away, carrying 34 women toward an uncertain fate that most would not survive. Catherine watched until it disappeared, Anna standing beside her in silence. "She will not find them," Anna said quietly. "You know that. Probably not." Catherine agreed. "But hope is cruel that way. It makes us do impossible things." August 25th, 1 week remaining. Catherine still had not secured her own placement. She had been so focused on helping others that she had neglected herself, had put her own survival last in the calculus of triage. Now she faced the same question she had asked others to answer. Where do you go when you have nowhere? 3 options were presented. She could accept repatriation to Germany, return to the ruins, and face whatever waited there. She could take a position as a domestic servant with an Austin family, live and help, at low wages and lower status. She could continue working for military government as a personal secretary to an officer, legal, but dependent on individual goodwill rather than institutional structure. None of them felt right. All of them felt like survival, without living existence, without purpose, breathing, without meaning. Sarah Henderson arrived from Austin on August 26th, finished with summer term, and returning to the University of Texas for fall semester. She had asked her father if she could visit the compound one final time before it closed, wanting to say goodbye to the women she had met, particularly Catherine Muller, who had answered her questions with honesty that refused easy comfort. Sarah found Catherine alone in the empty barracks, packing her meager belongings into a single bag, everything she owned in the world, fitting into a space smaller than a footlocker. "Miss Mueller, what are you going to do?" Catherine looked up, surprised by the directness of the question, surprised to see Sarah at all. "I do not know yet. I have 3 job offers. All of them mean survival. None of them mean living." "What is the difference?" Catherine sat on the bunk, the metal frame creaking under her weight. "Survival is waking up each day and enduring until sleep comes again. Living is waking up with purpose, with something to build toward, with a future that feels possible rather than just inevitable." Sarah made a decision in that moment, the kind of impulsive choice that defined character more clearly than years of careful deliberation. "Come to Austin. Stay with my family." Catherine stared at her, unable to process the words. "I could not possibly impose on your family like that." "It is not imposition," Sarah insisted. "My mother would love having another adult around. Dad is deploying to Japan soon for occupation duty. She will be lonely. You could help around the house. Maybe take some courses at the university. Start building a real life, not just surviving." "Sarah, I am a former enemy. Your neighbors would see a German woman living in your home. It would cause problems for your family." "Let them cause problems," Sarah said with the fierce certainty of youth. "My parents did not raise me to care what neighbors think when someone needs help." "Why would you do this?" Catherine asked, tears forming despite her efforts at control. "Your family has no obligation to me. Because my father spent 3 months protecting you from a world that wanted you dead," Sarah said simply. "And because when I met you, I saw what I might have become if America had lost. Scared, displaced, desperate. And I would hope someone would help me." Catherine could not speak. She simply nodded, accepting grace she had not earned and did not deserve, but desperately needed. Callahan approved the arrangement immediately when Catherine asked if it was genuine or youthful impulse. "Oh, it is genuine," he assured her. "Sarah called me last night asking permission. I said yes. You are comfortable with a former enemy soldier living in your family home." Callahan smiled, the expression tired but genuine. "Catherine, you stopped being the enemy the moment you asked for help instead of demanding it. Besides, my wife Barbara has been lonely with me deployed so much. She will appreciate the company." He leaned back in his chair, the springs squeaking. "Here is what I see. You are 32 years old. You lost everything. You could accept defeat, take whatever survival option presents itself, and live a small, careful life. Or you could try something harder. Actually, rebuilding a life with purpose. The University of Texas has extension programs for working adults. You could study, get American credentials, eventually apply for legal immigration status. It is a long path, but it is a path. And if it does not work," Catherine asked, "if I cannot adapt," "Then you tried," Callahan said. "That is more than most people do." August 30th, the final day. Fort Sam Houston compound, emptying like a house after a funeral, women scattering across Texas, across America, some back to Germany. 244 women who had arrived desperate were now dispersing into uncertain futures, carrying with them the knowledge that they had survived when survival seemed impossible. Catherine organized an informal memorial, not an official military event, but a private ceremony for the women who remained until the end. Each woman wrote the name of a lost family member on a piece of paper and placed it in a wooden box. They buried the box in the compound garden, planting it like a seed that might somehow grow into remembrance. Elizabeth spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears on her weathered face. "We bury our dead here in Texas soil, not because Germany was not their home, but because we survived long enough to properly mourn them. Major Callahan gave us that gift. Time to grieve." Anna raised her voice next. "We were enemies of America, but America treated us better than our own nation did. I do not know what that means about the world, but I know what it means about individual choices. Major Callahan chose mercy. We will remember." Maria, the youngest, spoke last. I was 23 when I arrived here. A broken child. I am still 23, but no longer a child. I survived because you all made me survive. Thank you. Catherine's turn came. When we begged to stay in May, people thought we were insane. Enemy prisoners refusing freedom. But we understood something they did not. Freedom without safety is not freedom. It is just exposure to new dangers. Major Callahan could have followed regulations, released us to chaos. Instead, he chose the harder path. He created space between war and peace where we could heal. Some of us are staying in America, some returning to Germany. Some do not know where they are going,